At 1600 hours on December 1940, Winston Churchill sat in his study at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, beginning a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt. Churchill had been postponing this letter for weeks, knowing what it required him to admit. Britain was going bankrupt. The empire that had financed wars across Europe for centuries, that had been the world's largest creditor nation in 1914, that had ruled the largest empire in history, was running out of money to buy weapons from America. The letter ran to 4,000 words, one of Churchill's longest wartime communications to Roosevelt. Most of it discussed military strategy, German capabilities, and British defensive preparations. But paragraph 20 contained the confession Churchill had been avoiding. The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. Britain was approaching bankruptcy, and when bankruptcy came, American weapons would stop flowing. Without American weapons, Britain could not continue fighting. Churchill phrased the admission carefully. He did not use the word bankrupt. He did not plead for charity. He presented the situation as a technical problem requiring creative solution, but the meaning was clear. Britain's gold reserves, the only currency America accepted under the Neutrality Acts, were nearly exhausted. Within months, Britain would be unable to pay for the weapons that stood between Britain and defeat. The crisis had been building since September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany. Britain's gold reserves on September 3, 1939, totaled approximately $864 million, about $3.5 billion at the 1939 exchange rate of roughly £4.03 per pound sterling. This was Britain's total liquid wealth available for purchasing weapons, supplies, and raw materials from abroad. Before the war, Britain had been the world's largest creditor nation with substantial overseas investments and international debts owed to Britain, but assets like colonial territories, shipping companies, or industrial plants could not be quickly converted to cash for buying American weapons. Britain needed to purchase enormous quantities of material from America: aircraft, tanks, trucks, ammunition, steel, aluminum, copper, explosives, chemicals, food. Every category of military and civilian supplies required imports because British production alone was insufficient. The British economy had not fully recovered from World War I and the Great Depression. British industrial capacity, while substantial, could not produce enough weapons to fight Germany alone. American production was essential, but American law prohibited credit to belligerent nations. The Neutrality Acts passed in the 1930s specifically prevented American companies from lending money to countries at war. The legislation was designed to prevent America from being drawn into European conflicts through financial entanglement, as many Americans believed had happened in World War I. The cash and carry provision allowed belligerents to purchase American goods if they paid cash and transported the goods on their own ships. No credit, no American shipping, no financial involvement. Britain accepted these terms because Britain had no alternative. British purchasing agents began placing massive orders with American manufacturers in September 1939. Aircraft from Lockheed, Douglas, and Boeing. Tanks from American Locomotive Company. Trucks from Ford and General Motors. Ammunition from DuPont and Remington. The orders totaled billions of dollars. Britain committed to pay cash for everything. The initial burn rate was manageable. In late 1939 and early 1940, Britain was spending approximately $30 million per week on American purchases, $120 million monthly, $1.4 billion annually. Britain's gold reserves of $3.5 billion could sustain this rate for approximately 30 months through early 1942. The timeline seemed adequate. Britain expected France to hold against Germany, creating a two-front war that would allow time for British rearmament. Then, France fell. On June 22, 1940, France surrendered after 6 weeks of fighting. Britain stood alone. The strategic situation transformed overnight. Britain now faced Germany without continental allies. The Royal Navy and Royal Air Force were Britain's only defenses. Both required weapons, equipment, and supplies that British industry alone could not produce in sufficient quantities. British purchasing agents in America accelerated orders. More aircraft, more ships, more ammunition. Everything Britain could buy. Britain ordered, The weekly expenditure climbed to $40 million, then $50 million by autumn 1940, at $50 million weekly. Britain was spending $200 million monthly, $2.4 billion annually. Britain's gold reserves would be exhausted by mid-1941 at this rate. The British Treasury calculated the deadline precisely. Chancellor of the Exchequer Kingsley Wood briefed the War Cabinet in November 1940. Gold reserves stood at approximately $2 billion. Committed expenditures for weapons already ordered exceeded $5 billion. Britain faced a $3 billion shortfall. Unless Britain found additional funding, British purchasing would have to stop by March or April 1941. Existing orders would be completed, but no new orders could be placed. American weapons shipments would decline rapidly afterward as existing orders were fulfilled. The implications were catastrophic. Britain could not fight Germany without American weapons. British factories could not produce enough aircraft to replace losses. British steel production could not support both military needs and industrial infrastructure. British agriculture could not feed the population without imports. If American supplies stopped, Britain's military capability would decline, civilian morale would collapse from hunger and shortages, and Britain would face defeat not through military conquest but through economic strangulation. Churchill understood this completely. He had been Prime Minister since May 1940, leading Britain through Dunkirk evacuation, Battle of Britain, and the Blitz. He had rallied British morale through radio addresses and parliamentary speeches. He had convinced Americans that Britain was worth supporting. But all the rhetoric meant nothing if Britain ran out of money to buy weapons. Churchill tried every alternative before admitting bankruptcy. First, Britain liquidated overseas investments. British citizens and companies owned substantial assets in American stocks, bonds, real estate, shares in American corporations. The British government requisitioned these assets under emergency war powers, sold them, and used the proceeds to buy weapons. The sales raised approximately $2 billion through 1940 and early 1941. But the assets were finite. Once sold, they could not be sold again. Second, Britain sold gold directly to America. The gold reserves were stored partly in Britain and partly in Canada and South Africa. Britain shipped gold across the Atlantic to pay for weapons. The shipments were dangerous. German U-boats hunted merchant vessels, including those carrying gold. Some gold was lost to submarine attack. Most reached America safely, but the gold reserves were depleting. Every shipment reduced Britain's remaining purchasing power. Third, Britain borrowed from Commonwealth nations and colonies. Canada, Australia, South Africa, and India provided loans or gifts to support British purchasing. The amounts were substantial. Canada alone contributed over $1 billion, but Commonwealth resources were also finite. The Dominions needed to maintain their own economies and militaries. They could not subsidize British purchasing indefinitely. Fourth, Britain attempted to negotiate credit arrangements with American companies. Could American manufacturers accept partial payment now and deferred payment later? Some companies agreed to limited credit, but most insisted on cash payment per Neutrality Act requirements. The companies were sympathetic, but legally constrained. Extending credit to Britain might expose them to legal liability or tax penalties. None of these measures were sufficient. By December 1940, Britain had exhausted most alternatives. The gold reserves were down to approximately $2 billion from $3.5 billion in September 1939. The weekly burn rate remained at $50 million. The calculations were simple and final. Britain had approximately 10 months of purchasing power remaining. After that, bankruptcy. After bankruptcy, military and economic collapse. Churchill wrote the December 8th letter to Roosevelt knowing it was Britain's last chance. Roosevelt had been sympathetic throughout 1940. He had provided military aid where legally possible. He had arranged the destroyers for bases deal trading old American destroyers for British base leases. He had encouraged American companies to fill British orders, but Roosevelt was constrained by American law and American public opinion. Neutrality Acts prohibited loans. Public opinion was deeply isolationist. Roosevelt could not simply give weapons to Britain without congressional authorization. Churchill's letter was carefully constructed to give Roosevelt political cover for asking Congress to change the law. Churchill presented Britain's situation as temporary financial difficulty rather than permanent insolvency. He suggested that Britain's commitment to fighting Germany served American interests. If Britain fell, America would face Germany alone. Therefore, helping Britain continue fighting was defensive measure for America, not charitable donation to Britain. Roosevelt received Churchill's letter on December 9th. He read it carefully. The strategic arguments were familiar. Roosevelt agreed Britain's survival served American interests. The financial admission was new. Roosevelt had known Britain was spending reserves rapidly, but had not been informed how close to bankruptcy Britain was. The letter made clear that without American action, Britain would be unable to continue purchasing weapons within months. Roosevelt spent the next 2 weeks considering options. He consulted advisors, he sounded out congressional leaders, he crafted public messaging. Then, on December 17, 1940, Roosevelt held a press conference where he introduced the garden hose analogy that would frame the Lend-Lease debate. If your neighbor's house is on fire and you have a garden hose, you lend them the hose to put out the fire. You don't demand payment. You want the hose back after the fire's out. The analogy was homespun, simple, designed for newspaper headlines. It obscured what Roosevelt was actually proposing, giving Britain weapons worth billions of dollars with no expectation of payment. The Lend-Lease legislation would take 3 months to pass through Congress. The debate was bitter, with isolationists opposing what they saw as step toward war, but Roosevelt prevailed. The Lend-Lease Act was signed into law March 11, 1941. Britain's bankruptcy was averted by weeks. British gold reserves in March 1941 stood at approximately $400 million, sufficient for perhaps 2 months of purchases at existing rates. If Lend-Lease had been delayed another month or two, Britain would have been forced to stop purchasing American weapons. But the 3-month delay from December 1940 to March 1941 created a crisis period where Britain's financial situation was desperate. British purchasing agents in America continued placing orders in December, January, and February, knowing Britain could not pay for everything ordered. They gambled that Lend-Lease would pass and that existing commitments would be retroactively covered. The gamble succeeded, but only barely. During this crisis period, British strategy was driven entirely by financial constraints. Military operations were planned around available resources rather than optimal strategy. The decision to send British forces to Greece in March 1941, which weakened British defenses in North Africa and contributed to subsequent defeats by Rommel, was influenced partly by need to demonstrate to American public opinion that Britain was actively fighting. Britain could not afford to appear passive. American support for Lend-Lease required belief that Britain was using military aid effectively. The financial crisis also affected Churchill's strategic communications with Roosevelt. Every letter emphasized British determination to fight, but also hinted at British resource limitations. Churchill needed to maintain image of British strength to justify American aid while simultaneously admitting British weakness to explain why aid was necessary. The balance was delicate. If Britain appeared too strong, Americans might question whether aid was needed. If Britain appeared too weak, Americans might conclude Britain would lose regardless of aid. The crisis revealed the limits of British power in ways that military defeats had not. Britain had survived the Battle of Britain, defeated German air attacks, maintained naval superiority, and held its empire. But these strategic successes were meaningless if Britain ran out of money to buy weapons. Financial collapse threatened to achieve what military force could not, forcing Britain to negotiate with Germany from position of weakness. The German leadership did not fully understand Britain's financial crisis. German intelligence knew Britain was spending gold reserves rapidly, but did not know how close to exhaustion Britain was. If Germany had realized Britain would be bankrupt by spring 1941, German strategy might have focused on delaying rather than attacking, let Britain exhaust itself financially rather than risk military campaigns. But Germany invaded Soviet Union in June 1941, while Britain was still economically viable due to Lend-Lease, missing the strategic opportunity that Britain's bankruptcy would have provided. British officials who managed the crisis performed extraordinary financial engineering to extend purchasing power. Treasury officials negotiated favorable payment terms with American companies when possible. Bank of England officials managed gold shipments to minimize transportation risks while maximizing cash flow. Colonial administrators extracted resources from empire to support British purchasing. The collective effort extended Britain's purchasing power by several months beyond what raw calculations suggested was possible. But ultimately, the extension was measured in weeks or months, not years. Without Lend-Lease, Britain would have been bankrupt by summer 1941 at the latest. The question then would have been whether Britain could continue fighting without American weapons. The answer was almost certainly no. British industrial production alone could not sustain military operations at the level required to defend against Germany. British agriculture could not feed the population without imports. British fuel supplies depended on imports. Bankruptcy would have forced Britain either to negotiate with Germany or to drastically reduce military operations while hoping America eventually entered the war. The financial crisis of 1940-1941 was Britain's closest approach to defeat in World War II, closer than the Battle of Britain, where Britain maintained air superiority, closer than the Blitz, where British morale held despite bombing, closer than any military campaign. The crisis was invisible to the public. Classified information restricted to senior government officials and Roosevelt's administration. But for those who knew the financial situation, the crisis was terrifying. Churchill later wrote that the period from December 1940 to March 1941 was among the most anxious of his prime ministership. Not because of immediate military threat the Wehrmacht was preparing to invade Soviet Union, not Britain, but because of the calendar counting down to bankruptcy. Every day that passed reduced gold reserves. Every week brought Britain closer to the moment when American weapons would stop arriving. The anxiety was constant and grinding. The successful passage of Lend-Lease transformed Britain's strategic situation more dramatically than any military victory. Britain went from facing bankruptcy within weeks to having effectively unlimited access to American production. The psychological relief was enormous. Britain could plan long-term military operations knowing weapons would be available. Britain could sustain civilian imports knowing food would reach British ports. The financial constraint that had dominated strategic planning for 18 months was lifted. But the cost was Britain's financial independence. Before the war, Britain had been creditor nation with substantial overseas investments and gold reserves. By 1941, Britain had liquidated most overseas investments, exhausted gold reserves, and was dependent on American charity disguised as loans. Britain would never fully recover the financial position it held before World War II. The empire that had financed European wars for centuries finished World War II as debtor nation dependent on American support. The financial crisis also transformed British-American relations. Before Lend-Lease, Britain and America were separate nations with friendly relations but distinct interests. After Lend-Lease, Britain was financially dependent on America. American preferences became British constraints. If America wanted Britain to adopt certain strategies or avoid others, Britain had limited ability to refuse. The financial dependency translated to strategic dependency. The crisis demonstrated that modern total war required more than military capability. It required financial resources to sustain operations over years. Germany faced similar financial constraints, but solved them through conquest and plunder of occupied territories. Soviet Union received Lend-Lease aid similar to Britain. Japan faced financial constraints that contributed to decision to attack Pearl Harbor. Financial capacity to sustain prolonged war was as important as military capacity to win battles. Britain's financial collapse, 1940-1941, was a crisis that remained mostly hidden from public view, but that senior officials recognized as existential threat. Churchill's December 1940 letter to Roosevelt was distress signal from nation facing bankruptcy. Roosevelt's Lend-Lease response was recognition that Britain's survival served American interests even at cost of billions of dollars. The financial crisis and its resolution through Lend-Lease determined that Britain would survive to fight alongside America when America eventually entered the war. Without Lend-Lease, Britain likely would have been forced to reduce military operations drastically, possibly to negotiate armistice, certainly to accept that Germany would dominate Europe unopposed. The moment Churchill realized Britain was bankrupt was probably sometime in autumn 1940, as Treasury officials briefed him on reserve depletion rates. The realization would have been gradual rather than sudden, watching the numbers decline week by week, calculating how many months remained, understanding that no alternative sources of funding existed. By December, when Churchill wrote to Roosevelt, the realization had become acceptance. Britain was going bankrupt. Only American aid could prevent it, and asking for that aid required admitting weakness that British pride resisted admitting. The letter worked because Roosevelt was already convinced Britain's survival served American interests. Churchill's careful phrasing gave Roosevelt the political argument needed to convince Congress. The garden hose analogy gave American voters simple metaphor for understanding complex policy. The 3-month congressional debate gave isolationists opportunity to oppose, but ultimately failed to stop legislation. By March 11, 1941, when Roosevelt signed Lend-Lease into law, Britain's financial crisis was resolved. But resolving the crisis required admitting dependence. Britain, which had financed European coalitions against Louis XIV, Napoleon, and Kaiser Wilhelm, which had been the arsenal of democracy in World War I, which had ruled the largest empire in history, was now dependent on American charity for survival. The empire would survive World War II, but the financial independence that had sustained the empire was gone. Britain finished the war victorious, but bankrupt, dependent on America for financial security, transformed from creditor to debtor, from superpower to junior partner. This was the financial collapse Churchill faced in December 1940. Not military defeat, not territorial loss, but bankruptcy that would have forced Britain to stop fighting regardless of will or capability. The crisis that Roosevelt's Lend-Lease resolved, but only after Britain had spent its financial independence purchasing survival. The moment when Britain's gold reserves ran out and Britain's strategic options reduced to a single choice, accept American aid on American terms or face economic collapse that would achieve what Hitler's armies could not accomplish. Churchill made the only choice possible. He asked for help, Roosevelt provided it, Britain survived financially, but at cost of independence it would never fully recover.